Hi, everyone. Well, I'm honored and flattered that so many people have decided to join me, and particularly touched by anyone who's decided to come in from around the world. I've heard there's a couple of people from places like Sri Lanka and Hong Kong where I'm pretty sure it's about 2 o'clock in the morning. So I really appreciate you guys being awake for this. I'll try and do my best to make it interesting. So I wanted to encourage a couple of things. First of all is that, obviously I'm quite nervous about this. When I get nervous, I talk quite fast. And so I know some people may not have English as their first language. So please, if I speak too fast, just go into the questions there and say, I didn't understand that. Harry spoke too fast. Could you repeat what you just said? I'm very, very happy to stop and slow down and say things again. Similarly, as I go through the live coding session, if anything is unclear or if there's anything you can't follow, please do ask questions. There's no such thing as a stupid question. And in fact, I'm going to reward, I'm going to give out a prize for the stupidest question of the day. And so the first person to ask a really stupid question will win a free copy of my ebook. And that's just to encourage you guys to ask questions as soon as possible. So that's me. So a little bit about my background, I guess. I'm quite a new programmer. I started programming professionally probably about 4 years ago. And I was lucky enough, as they said in the introduction, to fall in with a bunch of XP, extreme programming fanatics, who told me all about test-driven development. And I learned a lot in those 3 years. And so what I'm doing really, I guess, with this talk and with the book and with the workshops I do at conferences is just trying to teach that back to the community from the perspective of someone who's only just learned it. So I like kind of all the learning is still fresh in my mind. And I'm also, I've got all the enthusiasm of a recent convert. So I like to talk about it quite excitedly. The other thing I should say is that, I guess I was always open to the idea of TDD, but while I was at work, I thought that, gosh, the way that they did testing was pretty extreme. We're testing absolutely everything. I'm in a hurry as a programmer. I guess everybody is. And I sat there and I asked questions at every stage. God, we really have to write tests for everything? Oh, even this is a really simplistic test. Oh, for goodness sake. And I complained at every turn. But I came out of the other end of this with good answers to all of my questions, and I became convinced that this is definitely a good way of going about software development. Fine. My plan for today is to basically go over the first few chapters of the book that I'm writing. The book's called Test-Driven Web Development with Python. Catchy title. And what we're going to do is build a web application, a website, using Python and using the Django framework. And I'm going to go through and build that website from scratch. So I'm not assuming that you already have anything in terms of knowledge about Django. This is meant to be for beginners. So I'm going to try and introduce each of the concepts of Django and how it works. And we're going to start from nothing, build a website from the ground up, but with full test-driven development. So the other thing I should say is that I'm teaching really, really rigorous test-driven development here. Like I'm going to have tests at every single stage of the way. And I see this as a sort of practice. You can develop production applications like this. We do at PythonAnywhere. In your own career and with your own teams, you may decide to do however much testing you like. But here I'm showing you how to do tests for absolutely everything. Okay, without further ado, I guess, I'm going to start a screen share. And I'm going to start showing you how we build a web application with test-driven development. Are there any questions already? Has anybody asked anything just for my little preamble? Yasmina or Audra, is there anything out there?
No questions yet.
Nobody wants to win an ebook, huh?
Looks like you're all set to go.
Okay. Can everybody see the screen share there? Is that working?
It looks like we have a couple of people having trouble. But everything else is going well. So we're giving them an option to see it live at another place as well.
All right. So I can't see the little preview of the screen share on my screen here. So can you guys confirm that the screen sharing is going through and that you can see my little purple terminal window there?
We can't see it yet, but try re-screen sharing.
Okay, I'm just going to hit start again. All right. launch screen share. Yeah, I've got the little red window, but I haven't got the start buttons. So I might just quit from this and come back if I can.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Sorry for the little technical hitch there, folks. Mm-hmm. Just talk amongst yourselves.
All right, Harry, while you're getting the screen share set up on your end, folks, if you're just starting to join us now, we have an excellent webcast for you today, Test-Driven Web Development with Python with Harry Percival, and we are going to do some live demos and coding for you, and we're just getting that set up on our end. We would like to let you know, if you do have questions at any time to what Harry is talking to you about or showing you, please send those questions in, and you can do that by opening your group chat widget. It's located right there in your widget tray. It says group chat. Open it, type your message in, send it in, and we will take as many questions as we have time for. And I'll just check in with Harry. Harry, how are things going on your end there?
There you go. Yeah, I just had some fun. Kill all Firefox, kill all Java, restart that. And so I'm just hoping that that might work better. Here we go. All right, now I've got a window with an actual start button on. All right, now this is looking much more hopeful.
See, folks, you can tell this is live. Sometimes we have
no
tricky
tricks.
things.
Okay, live streaming in progress.
Perfect.
Maybe we
And
got
folks,
something.
it is opening up in another window on your computer, so you should see that now. Back to you, Harry.
Okay. And there you go. I can see it myself, so it really does work. Fine. Good. Okay. So the first step in any web development project, I guess, is to pick a web framework and start building a website and install Django and things like that. Wrong. The first step, if you're doing test-driven development, is to write a test. And so that's what we're going to do straight away. I'm going to build what's called a functional test. And a functional test here, we're going to use the Selenium tool, which is something that can actually open up a web browser for you, like a real copy of Firefox on your browser, and make it navigate to your test website and click around as if it were a real user. And then you can make some test assertions saying, well, does my website work the way I want it to? So I'm going to start a file here called functionaltest.py. And just do the simplest possible functional test, which would look like this from Selenium. Import WebDriver. And we're going to start a new WebDriver browser. So this is like a Firefox window, WebDriver. Firefox. We're going to tell the browser to go and get a page on our own PC. So that's going to be a HTTP localhost port 8000. That's where Django runs. And we're going to say, if this is working, you should see at the very end of the title has the word Django in it. Browser title. There we go. So that right there is probably the simplest imaginable functional test. We just open up a Firefox window using Selenium. We go and navigate to our test server, our web app that we want to build, and we're going to check on the page title. So should we try running that straight away? So I'm just going to run Python functional test.py. And what you should see, blink and you'll miss it. Here we go, and that's popped up a real Firefox window. You can see it all over the screencast there. It's navigated to localhost 8000, and it's given me an error, unable to connect. So that was our very first attempt. I'm just closing that there, at a functional test, and it's failed. Oh no, you might say. Well, actually, that's great news. That's what we call an expected failure. One of the first TDD concepts, I guess, that we're going to talk about is that when in test-driven development, which isn't just testing, you write the test first, and the first thing you expect to happen is that the test will fail. And this is what we call an expected failure. So it's failed in exactly the way we thought it was. So there we go. That's the first step of TDD there, is building a test, seeing it fail. And so then our next step, I guess, is to actually get it to pass. Can we install Django? So this is going to be our first sort of self-contained bit of TDD, is we write a test to see if we've installed Django correctly. And once we've installed Django correctly, it should pass. So to start a new Django project, there's a little tool called Django Admin. We start a project, we'll put it over here, and we're going to call it Superlists. because our app is going to be a lists app. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, to-do lists, it's the classic web tutorial example, and it's a good example. So what has that done? We've run a little Django admin project there. Let's have a look. It's built for me. Next to my functional test file, it's created a folder called superlist. It has a folder called manage.py, which is Django's Swiss Army knife. We'll see that a lot. In that, another folder called superlists. So yes, that's superlist/superlists. There are good historical reasons why that's the case. All right, so that's Django installed. And then Django, if we cd into superlist, comes with a little test server. And we can run that server. Run the server. And that will likely run a little version of your Django website for you on the computer there. And then if I open a second tab, I can go and rerun my functional tests and see if they pass. How about that? And there you go. Can you believe it? So that is our first ever test pass as well. It's left the window lying down here, but you can see that by default, Django is serving its work. This is Django's sort of hello world, I guess. Saying, oh, hello, right then, you've installed Django correctly. It's running on localhost 8000. If I go back to my window, Python functional test.py has completed successfully. So there you go. That is our first ever passing functional test. I mean, that is an absolutely minimum test. All it checks is that Django is working, but it's a good start. And so at this point, ordinarily, we would also do, when I teach TDD, I'm also teaching many of the other things that I feel have got me from being kind of a hack programmer to a sort of more professional. And in the book, I talk a lot about when to use version control systems. We use Git. So this would be the point at which I'd recommend starting the first ever commit for your project. You do something like this. Git st, git add functional tests, all right, and we'll git add superlists, and git status, and then we'll go git rm dash dash, and we're going to put all those pikes in there, superlists. Start a pike. Okay, and that would be your first ever commit. We'll call that initial commit. Installed Django. First Selenium FT. All right, so that is it, and that basically covers what I talk about in the first chapter of my book. So at this stage, I'd like to ask again if there are any questions. Is that clear so far? Does that make sense? Am I going too fast? Or shall we move on? Guys, is there anything out there?
It looks like there's a question. I've talked with engineers from Box, and they avoid Selenium except for the most critical pathways in the app because it is so incredibly slow and fussy at scale. In your experience, how does Selenium usage compare with unit tests and integration tests?
Okay, that's an excellent question. So Selenium time and the sort of TDD approach that I go over in the book says that you should probably have two types of tests. You should have unit tests, which ideally run very, very quickly, and you should have functional tests, which you're allowed to have run a lot slower. And now your functional tests are there to make sure your application really works from the point of view of a user. So you should have as many functional tests as you need to give yourself confidence that your application really works. Now, at PythonAnywhere, for example, in developing PythonAnywhere, we've written, there's probably about 300 functional tests, each one of which will start up Selenium, open a web browser, navigate around the website, and check the critical functionality works. So a full functional test run takes about 12 hours. Obviously, that's not something that I'm going to kick off every single time I make a tiny change. So yes, functional tests do take time, but ultimately they're the only thing that really reassures you that your application actually works. The functional tests don't cover everything that the unit tests do, but they should cover enough that you're really sure that everything's there. And the fact that the functional tests take 12 hours is absolutely fine. As you're developing, you might run one or two to make sure the bits you've run are there, and then continuous integration is there to run overnight and tell you by the next morning whether the whole application is still working and still ready to deploy. So yes, Selenium is slow, but day-to-day in your sort of development practice, that shouldn't be a problem. Separately from that, there is an issue which your unit tests, which you spend a lot more time running, should be very fast, but that's something that we can talk about later. I hope that answers the question. Is there anything else?
Looks like that's it for now, if you'd like to continue.
Fantastic. Okay, so here we are. We've written a functional test that tests that Django's installed. That's not a whole lot. So let's move on to the second topic, which is that as you saw that functional test running, we can run it again if you want. It was a little bit annoying because, well, it left this browser window lying around. I think you guys should see that. And so I have to go and close that manually, which is a little tedious. And second, when I run the functional test, there's no output. It's not telling me whether things are really working or not. So what I really want to do is be able to tell whether the functional test has passed or failed and have little outputs. And thankfully, there's all sorts of testing tools out there in the Python world that will let us do that. And so we're going to introduce at this point the unit test module. We also want to start changing our functional test to, aside from just checking that Django is installed, we want to start talking about what would we want our users to do. So at this point, I'm going to start writing out a functional test as comments. What we have is a sort of map here between user stories. I don't know who's familiar with extreme programming or some of the Agile methodologies. But in general, when you're designing your application from the point of view of the user, you might write a user story, which is I want my user to be able to go to the application, see this widget pop up, then they'll be able to see the following choices, and at the end, these sorts of things could happen. And that maps very well to functional tests. And the way we do it at PythonAnywhere is we write out our user story as comments inside the functional test file. So I'm just going to copy these from over here. And paste them in. Okay. I have something like this. And these comments are the kinds of things you might share with your stakeholders, your client, for example, or if you've got a business there, or maybe this is just you and a team of developers working things out. But we're going to write out in human-readable terms here what a user should be able to do. I like to give my users a name. For this book, the user is called Edith. In the old days of Resolver Systems, he was called Harold, and the PythonAnywhere one is called Florence. So Edith, we're going to say, okay, well, what do we want our users to be able to do when they go and see our awesome new lists application? So we're going to have a website where you can go in and write a to-do list. Okay, so Edith finds out about a to-do list. She goes to check out the home page. And then she's going to notice that the page is definitely about to-do lists. So she's going to spot that the page title mentions to-do lists, and so does a header on the page. We're going to say we want Edith to be invited to enter a to-do item. So she might type, ooh, I'm going to buy peacock feathers in a text box. It's good to have a personality for your functional testing users. They are quite unique people because they test a lot of dialog boxes. What you tend to find with your functional test users is they like to get everything wrong in every single possible way so that they see every single error message and they finally get it right. So it makes them a sort of OCD kind of personality there. So we're going to say Edith comes along. She types a new to-do list item into a text box. She hits Enter and sees it refresh. You can add a text item, and that refreshes again. And then she spots that the page has got sort of a URL at the top of it. So she can save that URL, close her browser, and come back to it another day, and her to-do list is still there. So that's the absolute minimal kind of to-do list application that you could imagine. It's just going to be a list of text items and one that will save them for you for the future. So that's what we call a user story. And then what we'll see is that we start to transform this user story into a real test when we start to implement bits and pieces. So we've got our building up the browser, and the assert to do in browser.title is the sort of first test there. But that shouldn't have changed a thing. We can rerun the functional test. Zip. And so here we've got our first test failure, which is that we were saying, is Django in the browser title? Well, now we want Edith to find to-do in the browser.title, and so that's failing. So good, that's our first test failure that's telling us to move forwards and start writing some code for our read application. Now, we've got these problems again that, assertion error isn't exactly a very helpful error message. It'd be nicer if, that told us, okay, it didn't say to do, but it did say this. And secondly, it's not tidying up the window. So let's use the unit test library that I was talking about earlier, which is going to give us some better tools for cleaning up after test runs and for giving us better error messages. I'm going to import unit test at the top of the test here. So I'm going to start unit test. Divides things up into classes. So this is a test for a new visitor. Test case. Okay. So we're going to have some setup before each test. We want to do some automated actions that sort of set up the test. And that's going to be start the browser. So each one of our tests is we're going to want to start up a new web browser. And similarly, when we finish with each test, we're going to have a method here called teardown, which is going to quit the browser. Okay, so setup and teardown are methods that are built into unit test, and they say, okay, well, whenever we run a test, we're going to run setup before the test and teardown after the test, and that lets you do some cleaning up and setting up before each one. And then the actual test in unit test is any method that starts with test underscore. So creating a new list. All right, and so I'm going to take all of this, indent it up, change this to self.browser.get. And finally, instead of just using this sort of Python assert keyword, we're going to use one of unit test's assertion methods, which is assert equal, or assert in fact. Self.browser.title. Zip. All right, the final thing we need to do is just actually run that test. And when we do that is we have a little if done the name equals done the main. All right. All right, and that is a minimal unit test Selenium functional test. Typically that run. Okay, so I hope that's caught up with you. You should find the output is a lot clearer now. You spotted the window popped up, but it was also closed automatically for us. And instead of just having that old error message that says, assertion error with no explanation, we've got a much clearer message that says, oh, well, the thing to do will not find in the actual title of the page, which is welcome to Django. So that's a little incremental improvement there. That's the contents of my chapter 2 in the book. At this point, we would probably do a code as well, say that we've changed functional test. So we can do git commit daily, and we call it switch to using unit test. And we're looking for to do in browser title. Okay. Fine. What we're going to do is ignore these Pike files. Let's go echo star.pike.get ignore. All right, guys, that's the end of my chapter 2. I decided to make the first couple of chapters of the book really small and really bite-sized, just to make sure that we're taking things easy. Are there any questions at this stage? We've started a functional test to see that Django is installed. We've changed that functional test to start asking about to-do lists. We've specced out our first functional test using comments to spell out a user story of what we want to happen on our website. And we switched to using unit test. So are there any questions at this stage?
Yes, we have a few questions actually. One is, will you be pushing the code to a repository, I'm assuming, for later review?
Okay, good. Let me take that one quickly. I suggest in the book that you do that. And in fact, when we get to, this is chapter 2, when we get to chapter 8 in the book, I talk about deployment and how to upload your code to a real server. And at that point, we do use a code sharing site to pull and push code from. Yeah, I would recommend that. That's a good idea, and the book does mention it.
Great. Another question is, you've mentioned extreme programming a couple of times. What is it? Can you suggest any references?
Yeah. So the guru, I guess, of extreme programming, so extreme programming is one of probably the first agile software development methodology. If you guys have heard of Scrum, that's a sort of extreme programming, one of the alternatives to it. And it was invented by, I believe I'm getting my history right here, a guy called Ward Cunningham and Kent Beck, who were big in the Smalltalk scene. And what they said was they were allowed to run a development team however they wanted, And they said, well, what are all the things we wish we could do, but we've never been able to when we haven't been the managers of our own team? And they were things like testing, they were things like user stories, they were things like driving development, not by deadlines, but by iterations in terms of what can we do and rapid changes. I mean, I don't want to give the whole history of extreme programming now, but it's definitely a good read. So I would look out for one of the extreme programming, I think it's called Extreme Programming Explained by Kent Beck. And so these guys are also the originators of test-driven development. The other big technique they use is pair programming. So they said, gosh, well, if we really could make all the choices ourselves, why wouldn't we just have two people sitting down at the same computer and writing code? Because we think that's the best way of getting really high-quality code. So extreme programming says you must use test-driven development, you must have a sort of iterative Agile development model, and you just use pair programming. And that's what we do at PythonAnywhere. Any other questions?
Are there any resources you'd recommend to start with Selenium?
I would recommend a book that I'm writing called Test-Driven Web Development with Python by Harry Percival. It's me. Yeah, I mean, in the book I go into, I mean, there's chapters written, we're going to cover all the stuff that talk about all the sort of things that you can do with Selenium. The only other resource I've ever used is the Selenium documentation and the actual source code. The main bits of Selenium, the main Python files are actually pretty small, so you can just browse through them, and I'll show you quickly. Apply Selenium. I wonder whether it's called. Yeah, I mean, just looking through the source code of Selenium has also, you can actually go and see all of the methods that might be available, for example, on a browser, and navigate to the ones you're sort of looking for. So, gosh, I wish that Selenium has got a way of double-clicking on something. Yep, sure enough, there it is with some documentation in the source. Any more?
Yes, it looks like we have one more. Do you use Jenkins with Python? Is there a better CI server for Python?
So I have not used Jenkins, but I am planning on talking about it in the book. Several of my sort of colleagues and peers in the Python world are definitely preferring that one. At PythonAnywhere, we use BuildBot because that's what they started off using sort of 6 or 7 years ago. So I don't want to answer that question because I have no experience of it, but it does seem like Jenkins is the popular choice these days for continuous integration. Okay, thanks for the questions. So let's move on. So far we've done some very, very simple things. Let's move on then to what was actually Chapter 3 in my book. And in this one, the plan is to start actually building a home page for our website. So we've got a functional test fading saying, come on, we need the user to be able to log in and see that this is about to-do lists, not just a welcome to Django page. So the next stage in any Django project, Django likes to structure things into projects, and within projects you have apps. So the idea is that if you can break your website into sort of reasonably separate bits of functionality, you would put each bit of functionality, like for example, maybe your login system is one bit, maybe if you have a forums part of your website, that could be an app. And here we're going to have a lists, which is going to be the main part of our app, of our project. And we break it up into an app. The logic is that in theory, if you had a really good app in one project, you might even be able to take it out and reuse it in another project. Now, personally, I've never actually seen that done, but other people in the real world do it. So projects contain apps, and the way we start a new app inside a Django project is that we use another manage.py tool. So which folder would I have here? Python. Manage.py, and so start app is the command, app, and so we're going to call it lists. So this is the main app for our lists. Okay, and so you'll see what that's done is it's created a new folder called lists alongside the manage.py and superlist folders, and inside lists are several little files by default, but .py, which makes into a Python module, models.py, which we'll find out about shortly, views.py, and probably what's of immediate concern to us is tests.py. And so the very next thing that we're going to do is write our first unit test. So probably I should talk a little bit about the difference between functional tests and unit tests. So like any distinction, this is a distinction that can blur. But and that there's what are called functional tests. Other people would refer to as black box test or acceptance tests or perhaps system tests. But the point is that you need to have at least one level of test that's high level and that looks at your whole application from the point of view of a user. So that's what we're doing our functional tests, saying, okay, well, from the user's point of view, can they interact with my app? Does it all work together? Does everything function? And then there's another level of test that's very useful in TDD, which is what I'm calling unit tests. And the idea of a unit test is instead of looking at your application from the point of view of the user, we look at the application from the point of view of the programmer. And so while the purpose of a functional test is to check that your app really works, the purpose of a unit test is really to help you write code, and it's to help you write code that's well designed, that works, that's sort of bug-free. And what it forces you to do is A, break up your code into sort of sensible small units that can easily be tested, and B, it forces you, before you start writing code, if you're forced to write a test first, it actually forces you to think about how you want your code to behave from the outside point of view. And the theory is that leads to better design code. So that's the general idea. We have functional tests at the top level that check that the whole application works. And then for each little bit of code that we write, each new function, each new class, we're going to write a unit test to make sure that before we write the actual function, to sort of specify how we want it to work. So high-level tests and low-level tests. Now Django encourages us to write unit tests, and it creates this file at list.test.py. And I thought we'd go and take a look at it. Okay. Okay, so tests. There it is. Okay, so this is the default test class. This is the default test class that Django puts in there for you. Django does a lot of things in terms of helpful comments, and it's sort of self-explanatory. And the simple test is just checking that 1 + 1 = 2. Okay. So what we're going to do here is just to see if everything works the way we think it does. We're going to deliberately break this test. I'm going to make it say assert 1 + 1 = 3. And the purpose here is that when I run the sort of test runner that should run all the tests ever, I should see one fail, saying 1 + 1 is not equal to 3. So that's just my little experiment there. Okay. So how do we run the unit tests in Django? It's a manage.py command, Python manage.py test, and we're going to call, and so Python manage.py test is the general command saying, Django, run all the tests for me, please. So let's try that now. When your screen updates, you'll see that that's just spewed quite a lot of output all over my screen. It says it's run 404 tests. Loads and loads of crap has happened. But the important thing is, you can see right there at the end of the line, is that Django is telling us why it's unhappy. And it's saying that settings.database is improperly configured. So it's saying, oh, I'm Django. I don't know how to run tests unless you configure a database. So please do that for me. So we'll go and look at Django's settings file, which is the next topic I want to talk about. Okay. So in the superlist/superlist folder is Django's sort of project-wide settings. And this is the place where you would sort of configure things that apply to your whole application. And that includes what database do you want to use. And so Django provides you a little wrapper around the database that you use, which will let you use a simple database like SQLite just as easily as you could use Postgres or MySQL. And what we're going to just say, okay, well, for now, Django, I want you to use SQLite. So we're changing exactly one line of code here, changing that to a SQLite 3. And we'll just try running our tests again. Does that work any better? Hooray! So Django is already much happier. And then the next puzzle really is, what is it doing running all these tests? I mean, as far as I know, there's only one, but it's run 479 of them. And then the second puzzle here is, we wrote a test that says 1 + 1 = 3. So that would definitely have failed, but we're not really seeing it. So what's going on here? Well, first of all, when you say, Django, please run all your tests, it runs all of its own tests as well as your application's tests, which is a controversial decision. But if you wanted to just run the test for one of your apps, you can also tell it to do that. So let's just say, okay, well, just run the test for this app that we just created, please. That's the one that should fail. Test singular, please. List. Okay. Improperly configured. An app with label list cannot be found. We just made this app you might be frustratedly shouting. Well, the thing about Django is that you tell it things twice. So even though we've run start app, we also need to say in settings.py, look, I really meant it. I really did want an app called lists. And that in here in a variable called install apps. So this is a list that configures your project and say, well, here are all the apps that I want to run for this this project. Here are some default ones that Django has for you, and then your own ones you would list in here. So there we go, and we say, okay, seriously, I want to use the lists app that I've just made. And we'll try running the test again, and this time we get our expected failure. Fantastic. So that's good. We've built our first app, and we've run the sort of Django flavor of the unit tests, and we've checked that they really can run some tests that we added. So at this point, you could, if you wanted to, do another code. I'm going to skip that for now. And let's move on to actually writing the unit test that we want. So what do we want at the moment? If we want to remind ourselves of where our functional test is failing, is it's saying, oops, I put it in the wrong folder. Some functional tests. If we remind ourselves why the functional test is failing, it's saying, okay, well, the main page of your website isn't, and in fact, it's saying problem loading page. I'm not running the server. Run the server. The main page of the website isn't obviously about to do this. So we want to start configuring a home page for our site. So how do we do that? In Django or in any web server, the web server has two jobs. Its job is to take a request that the user makes, and that request will be for a particular URL on the site, and it needs to turn that into a response. And that response will typically be some HTML to show the user in their browser. So we split that up into two steps in Django and most web frameworks. One is sort of translating, decoding a URL, and so for each URL, we then want to assign that to a function that can return an HTTP response, basically some HTML text. So that's two things. And the first bit that we're going to test is the URL translation. So let's make sure that when someone asks for the root of the website, which is the sort of / URL, and that calls a function that we're going to define in the which is what Django calls the views function. Okay, so we want to translate a / URL into a view function. So let's open up test.py and write a test for that. Now, this is very much testing the internals of Django, but this is one of the things, and it's going to be a very simplistic test. But as your URLs get more and more complex, these sort of things can get easy to get wrong. As you start with a simple test like this, so that when it gets complicated, you've got a placeholder to use. Okay. So let's tidy up our little test class here. This is going to be, we wanted this to be, say, our home page. Okay, so say the function that Django uses to actually resolve URLs is called resolve. So that's in from django.com.l resolve. So this is what happens when a user asks for the root page of the website, and we resolve /, and then we're going to check that / is going to map to home page. Home page function we're going to expect to be defined in list.views import home page. So that is our first unit test. Now you remember what I was saying earlier about how the functional test really tests things from the point of view of the user, whereas a unit test takes things from the point of view of the code, from the point of view of the programmer, and this is very much a coding test. It's saying, all right, testing some very specific bits of mechanics of our application. Does the URL / map to a particular function in our application? So does anyone know what will happen if we try and run this test? Let's have a look. import error, cannot import name homepage. So sure enough, this is pretty much an uninteresting test failure, but this is really the point of TDD, is you always start with the test, not by writing code. So we don't even have a function called homepage in our list of views. Let's go and put one in. So can you guess what I'm going to write here? What? That's ridiculous. I have to imagine what you guys are sort of saying at the other end, because otherwise it's a very much a one-way call. So I'm going to pretend it was me that was being presented to. And if this was the code that someone had just written, and in fact my colleagues did this when I first learned PythonAnywhere, they would do things like this: homepage equals none. Now we know that this needs to be a function. Why would you ever write something like homepage equals none? That's ridiculous. Well, the idea of unit testing and in TDD is to make sure that every single bit of your code really is driven by the test and really does have a test for it. So the simplest possible thing I can do to make the current test failure pass, which is at the moment it's complaining that it can't import homepage, is we just put an object called homepage, any object, and if later the tests are unhappy and they want it to be a function, well then great, we can turn it into a function. But for the unit test code cycle, when we're being very careful, is a matter of making minimal code changes and running the test each time. So let's have a look at that. Fantastic. So already the test is changing, and it's saying, look, I tried to resolve the slash URL, and it's a 404. I don't know how to find a slash URL. So we don't even have to define a U function yet. We can even start by just defining URL. So here's the next stage of Django that we're going to talk about. So here's the place where Django actually maps URLs to view function. It's a function called urls.py. And a URL mapping maps a regular expression. So for anybody in the audience who doesn't know what a regular expression is, just pop that down on your notebook and go and look it up. But basically it's a way of matching text. And we're going to say that the root of the page, which is this $, which means nothing, is going to map to a function called homepage that lives in lists app. Okay, so that's our very first URL there. Let's see if that works. Fantastic. Only now we've made a tiny little change. Did the test actually say, oh, okay, this homepage thing of yours is not an actual view function. I need it to be a function. So that justifies us going over to the views and changing it into a function. So that will be our first placeholder for a view function. Ta-da! And that's our first test. So that was a very specific test that tests Django, but it does now check that we've written the right kind of thing in urls.py. Now we've got a very simple URL that just takes a simple slash and maps it to a simple function. Later on in Django, you get to much more complex URLs, which maybe will use regular expressions to capture parameters straight out of the URL and map them to different places depending on conditions. So while we have a very simple test now, it's a good harness for more complex tests later. I want to move on and show you a second unit test, and then we'll have a break for questions. So we've got a simple test for our URL. Now let's get on to the meat of it, which is that we would like our view function to actually return some real HTML, a real HTTP response to the user. Let's go back into our tests. And we're going to test, homepage. And so we're just going to have correct HTML. Now, as much as possible, your test method names, like these ones here, should be human readable and descriptive test methods that say, well, what is this test really testing? And it avoids having long and sprawling comments everywhere. So we're going to create an HTTP request. And that comes from HTTP import HTTP. We're going to send that request to our view function, which is called homepage. That's going to send us back a response. And we're going to make some assertions about the response.content. So let's see what's happening here. Again, you can see this is very much a test from the point of view of what happens to Django. This HTTP request is what the user's browser will be sending to Django. That's the class that it uses to represent browser requests. That's going to get sent to our homepage function by the URL resolver, and we expect the homepage function to return a response. So if you remember, our functional test was saying, your homepage didn't have the right title. So we want our response to be some valid HTML. So let's say, for example, that we want our response to start with HTML. So response content.start with. So these are the minimal kinds of tests that you might want, or some valid HTML. So it should start with HTML, and maybe it should end with HTML. And then finally, to get our test to pass, we want to make sure that, say, the title of the page is to-do lists. Fine. So that looks like a unit test for the home page view. At the moment, this is testing the raw text of the HTML that comes through. As we progress, we'll start to moving on to using templates and do less of testing sort of string constants. But this is a nice place to start. It explains how the home page view will work, that it returns a response, and the response.content is the actual HTML. So now let's see if we can run that. Okay, so here's our first failure then. And now we're getting into what's called a sort of unit test code cycle. Now I'm talking through all of these, and you may be thinking, there's a lot of messing about with making tiny little changes to the code and rerunning the tests, and that sort of whole home page equals none. Isn't that going to make development take ages and everything? Well, I'm talking through it here, but actually day-to-day when you're doing TDD, you can flick between running tests and writing code very, very quickly. So this doesn't actually slow you up at all. So homepage takes the argument. I'm going to try and get into this a little bit quicker so you give you guys a flavor of how the sort of rhythm of unit test code cycle happens. So homepage takes no argument. Give it one, views. Okay, so view like a home page takes a request. All right, let's try again. Okay, next test failure is none type has no attribute content. So we've made a view, it can take a request, but it doesn't actually return anything. So let's make it return something. Django.http import HTTP response, and we'll return an empty HTTP response. Fantastic. So now we've got an actual response, but it's saying, well, the content doesn't start with HTML. Okay, let's go and do that. And we run that. HTML. Okay, made a little test error there. All right, the next failure is that it doesn't have the HTML title that we wanted. Let's go and put that in. And finally, it wants with HTML. Fantastic. So that is a test pass, and we have now got a view function that's returning some minimal HTML that includes the HTML opening and closing tags and the title block. So I wonder if that will be enough to get our functional test to pass. Yes. Now that might have seemed a little bit like magic. Let me run it again. All you guys probably have seen is a white screen popped up quickly. So let me show you that a little bit more slowly. The way I'm going to do that is, because I'm running the test server, I can actually open up a web browser myself, go to localhost 8000, and go and see what it looks like. It looks like nothing, but I hope you guys can see at the top left there the title is working. So we've really got a Django app that's serving a web page that has the title to-do lists. So that was the very first stage of our switch from using just a functional test to using a functional test and a unit test. Let me just check my notes here, but I think that brings us to the end of Chapter 3. There we go. And so at this point, we might do a commit, saying something like, here we've got a minimal view returning the correct title. It's time to extend our functional test. So that takes us to the end of Chapter 3. We've talked about running the Django development server. You can visit it in your browser. We've made a functional test using unit tests. You can check what's happening on the website. And we've built our first view, mapping a URL to a view function. And we've seen how unit tests differ from functional tests and that they're much closer to the code. And we've also seen a little bit about the unit test code cycle, where we write a unit test and then we flick between running the unit test and making the minimal change that addresses its current failure. And that technique allows us to make sure that at every stage our development is driven by the tests. And what that ensures is that every single bit of code is tested. And that helps get you maximum code coverage. So let me pause for questions. How are we getting on? Any thoughts out there?
Yes, we have quite a few questions, actually.
Oh, God.
Do you have to download Chrome driver to use Chrome instead of Firefox for testing?
That is correct. Yes, you do.
All right. And I've heard it said that whenever you are tempted to use a print statement to chase down a bug, write a test instead. I've never been able to manage that. Do you find that a good way to go about it, though?
Yeah, no, I've got to be honest and say I use print statements an awful lot. I mean, they are a useful debugging technique. I mean, certainly when you have, or the TDD kind of approach suggests that when you find a bug in your application, you should write a test that fails because of that bug, and then you should go ahead and find ways to fix it. But certainly, so that would be a functional test typically. You know, maybe the login form doesn't highlight incorrect passwords correctly or whatever bug. So you're going to write a functional test that says, well, make sure that really does work. And then you're eventually going to write some unit tests to fix that bug. That's the idea of writing a unit test instead of a print statement. I think maybe that comes from a world in which you haven't already got very good unit test coverage. So, I wouldn't say never, ever use a print statement. I would say that if you're looking at your code and you find you could have written another unit test and it would have found this bug, then you should definitely be writing that test. That's a slightly wide about answer. I hope that answers the question. What else is out there?
If you are using class-based generic views, how does your approach change?
Yeah, I think I'm going to talk about that a little bit later in the book. My experience is mostly with view functions, but really your unit tests are there to make sure you have at least a test that justifies writing whatever line of code it is. So whether you're using a class-based view or a view function, ultimately you're going to want to make sure that that class or that function does return the right kind of HTML, and you need some kind of test that's going to invoke it one way or another. Later in the book, I talk about using the Django test client, which will sort of hide some of the complexity of dealing with individual views. Some people like to use the Django test client. Other people really like to stay close to the code and call the individual functions. So these are just different tools that you can use. And ultimately, once you've learnt how to do extremely rigorous TDD, like the kind that I'm sort of demoing here, you can then decide for yourself, okay, do I need to test here, or what's the best way of testing this? I think it's all something that once you've got the tool set becomes obvious.
All right. And during an actual app development, do you still develop one unit test at a time, or would you write several tests and then solve those before moving on?
Yeah, good question. I think that varies a lot. Yeah, there are certain times when you would write more than one unit test. So if you know for sure that your function needs to be able to handle several types of input, or it's got different types of logic in different cases, you might find yourself writing more than one unit at once. But in general, the approach where you just go, well, let's try and build the simplest possible thing first and add complexity in later, that's the sort of approach that that I'm trying to encourage. And that often you can get away with writing just one test for the simple case, make sure that passes, and then get on to the complex case. So yes, sometimes no. I don't think there's a fixed rule here. Anything else?
Yes. How much Django do I need to know to take advantage of your book?
So my plan is to make this totally open to the Django beginner. So I explain at every single stage of the book which bits of Django we're using, how they work, why they work, from the point of view of someone that's never used it. I don't think that my book is enough to learn Django. So at every stage I'll say, well, look, we're using this tool. If you want to find out more about it, go and check the Django documentation at this point. Or, when you're building your own app, you'll need to use more than just this simple version. Here's the bits where you can do further research. So my book isn't meant to be a Django book. It's not meant to teach Django. But it does want to teach TDD to an audience that might never have used Django. So the answer to the question is you don't need to know Django to read the book.
Great, and we have one last question from a new Python user. He says, are those assert statements built into Django or Python?
Okay, let's take a look. Kind of asserts that we've got now. These ones like the assert equal, assert in, they all actually come from the unit test module. So it's not quite clear in this. Let me just show functional tests, for example. So when we import unit test here, we'll then have our test class inherits from unit test.testCase. And so then when we use a self-stud function, that must be a function that's defined on that class. So assert in comes from the unit tests module. And so that gives you all sorts of useful helper functions like assert true, assert false, assert equal. Assert in is very useful. That checks the membership of a list or whether a string is contained in another string. There's things for checking that regular expressions match. There's things for checking that sets are equal, so that you've got two lists that have the same contents, not necessarily in the same order, and so on. So that's the answer for all the ones we've used so far, a part of unit test. And then you'll see that in the Django testing, we've imported a special class called test case. Now this actually inherits from unit test. So the Django test case gives you all of the unit test cases, and it also gives you several other little tools that are sort of Django specific. We haven't used any of them here, but later in the book we do cover them. Fine. Okay, if that's the last question, I was going to check how much longer do we have on the clock.
We are at the top of the hour, Harry, but if you'd like to continue, we do have more time for you.
Okay. I actually should have asked this before, but I can keep going forever here. So was it meant to end about now? Is that right?
Well, would you like to leave the audience with a wrap-up?
Yeah, I think that's better because trying to do the next thing would probably take more than just 10 or 15 minutes. Yeah, let's do let's do a wrap up. So I hope that's been useful. As always with the perils of live coding, typing takes up a lot of time. But I want to give you guys a flavor of what TDD feels like. And I also wanted to give you a flavor of how you start from scratch with test-driven development. So a lot of people say, I want to do TDD, I don't know where to start. And so in my book and in my tutorials, I like to show it starting from scratch, starting from nothing. How do you do test-driven development from the very first file we create, which was functional test.py, through to how does it interact with the very first configurations of our web framework of Django, how do functional tests and unit tests differ, and what order should I write them. So those are the sorts of things I'm trying to cover. We haven't got very far. This is just chapter 3. In the book from here, we go on to using Django's templates, which instead of writing HTML as sort of strings like this in our list views, obviously we don't want to write HTML as a sort of Python string. So we get to write HTML in template files instead, and I show how TDD will work with that. When we start to use the database and wanting to sort of save our list for later, I talk about how to write tests for Django's models and how we save things to the database. And as we progress with the book, I then go on as quickly as possible to start talking about some of the other issues in TDD that or in web development, which aren't always covered. So I very early in the book say, right, okay, now let's try and deploy our application. Let's put it on a real web server. How does test-driven development interact with that? What kind of testing can we use when we deploy an application to make sure that our deployment works? Because I'm sure any of you that have done any web development have come across the problem that it works fine on your own PC, but once you put it on the server, everything is broken. So I talk about the ways that testing can help with that. And that's about as far as I've concerned with writing. Chapters currently. I'm on chapter 9. Take us to the end of the sort of first book. I'm going to talk a little bit about login forms, and then I'm going to move on to talking about JavaScript. So this is the great bane of the existence of Python programmers and many other languages, is that ultimately web development does involve writing JavaScript and making a sort of more dynamic client side. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. What kind of unit tests can you use for JavaScript? And of course, the great power of Selenium that I've introduced there is that it lets you test JavaScript. So because you're opening a real web browser, you can test the behavior of the JavaScript on your page. So that'll be the early part of the second book. And I say second book, this is just a second part of the book that I'm writing now. We're going to cover JavaScript. We're going to cover switching to, say, a Postgres from a SQLite database. We're going to cover asynchronous. So instead of using Django as the web server, I don't want this to be an entirely a Django book. We're going to switch to maybe Tornado or what's it called, Twisted. And write maybe a sort of asynchronous part of our application. We're going to talk about WebSockets. And then we're going to sort of talk performance testing and memcached and continuous integration and BDD and all sorts of fun things like that. So if you've enjoyed the talk, I hope you come and check out the book. The website is www.obeythetestinggoat.com. If you're puzzled by that title, go and take a look because it explains everything about what the testing goat is. And the book is available to purchase, but you can also read it for free. That's my sort of try as before you buy scheme. I have the whole book published under a Creative Commons license, so it will be free for all time. I hope, of course, that everybody reads it, finds it so good that they decide to go ahead and make a purchase. But in the meantime, it'll be out there. And I really hope that you guys start reading that book and get any feedback. So is it working as a book? Do you think I need to change things? Are there some topics you'd like to see covered? Am I explaining things well? Are there any bits that you're confused? I really want as much feedback as possible from people out there. Yeah, I think that's me. Thanks very much again to all of you who've joined me. I really am. I can't quite believe that so many people have turned up for it. I'm in awe, especially everyone around the world. And I hope I come and do these workshops. I do this sort of this kind of spiel at Python conferences around the world. So if you're ever at EuroPython or PyCon US, you might catch me doing a sort of TDD tutorial like this. So I hope to meet you guys someday.
All right. Thank you so much, Harry. That's it for today's webcast, everybody. I hope you all got the code that we pushed out for a discount on Harry's book, Test-Driven Web Development with Python. And we'd just like to thank you all for joining us today, and a job well done to Harry and for presenting to all of us. And we hope to see you at future webcasts. Again, thank you, Harry, and goodbye.
Thanks very much, Yasmin and Audra, our wonderful moderators. Goodbye, everyone. Hope to see you soon. Bye.